Hello, my name is Kenneth Hafertepe. I'm a professor of museum studies at Baylor University, and I'm here to talk to you about Lost Waco, an architectural heritage at risk. This interest of mine is best seen in my book, Historic Homes of Waco, Texas, which came out in 2019. This is a book that showcases 120 historic houses here in Waco and the people who designed, built, and/or lived in them. People were surprised that there were that many historic buildings left in Waco because so many things have happened over the years, including the infamous 1953 tornado, which devastated a swath of downtown Waco. But there are quite a few houses, although even in the time in which I was preparing this book, a number of important Waco houses have been demolished. One reason for this perceived lack of historic buildings is simply so much of early Waco was in the area that we now think of as downtown. This is Waco in 1873. You see the suspension bridges there. You can see the courthouse surrounded by trees on the town square just to the upper right of that. But looking out to the upper right, you'll notice that the suburbs of town are now around Austin Avenue and 8th Street, which is really kind of mind-boggling to us. Essentially what you're seeing on this map, which was Waco in 1873, is now just the center of the city. Because of that, because of the natural growth that occurs over time, buildings are taken down so that new buildings can be erected to house new businesses, homes, and the like. So there's a natural replacement of old buildings, but as time goes on, we begin to appreciate those old buildings and begin to notice when significant examples are demolished for whatever reason. Perhaps the most famous Waco building that no longer exists is this house. This is the William and Flora Cameron House. It was built 1878-79, not too long after that bird's eye view we were just looking at, and actually built just a little further out on Austin Avenue. This was around 12th Street and Austin. This was one of the great Victorian houses in Texas. In fact, it was included in Blake Alexander and Todd Webb's book, Texas Homes of the 19th Century, one of the very few Waco houses to be included in that important volume. The house did survive into the 1960s, and so we were fortunate to get a couple of very high quality color photographs taken by Daniel D. Reif, who was a young assistant professor at Baylor and who kindly shared these photos with me. He shared not only this photo of the house as it existed in 1964, but he also showed the house as a ruin after an arsonist lit a match and watched this wooden house go up in flames. So it was a pretty sad loss for Waco, one of the great Victorian houses designed by W.W. Larmor, who we now know and admire because he designed Old Main and Georgia Burleson Hall on the Baylor campus and many other houses in Waco. And now in all the years after this 1967 fire, the lot on which the Cameron House stood is a parking lot in downtown Waco. So nothing was ever built in its place. The son of William and Flora Cameron, William Waldo Cameron, and his wife Faith built this house in 1910. Once again, the Camerons turned to a professional architect. In this case, it was Roy E. Lane, who was the supervising architect for the Alico building just a couple of years after this. And it was certainly one of the most impressive houses ever built in Waco. In fact, it really looks like it should be up in Newport, Rhode Island, or one of the resort communities where America's rich would gather. Fortunately, we do have the blueprints for this design, which are preserved at the Texas Collection at Baylor University, which gives us the arrangement of rooms, all of the room names from 1910. It's really pretty remarkable documentation. In addition to the two main floors, there were even rooms and up in the attic space, which you can see is marked by the large dormer in the center and flanked by dormers to the side. Unfortunately, this house ended up being donated to become the Waco-McLennan County Public Library. The remodeling that was done at that time weakened the structure, which was also damaged by the installation of heavy bookshelves and then heavy books on those. So ultimately, after a few years, it was determined that the building was structurally unsound, and it was demolished to make way for the current Waco-McLennan County Public Library. A pretty serious loss, but I think it boils down to expecting too much out of an old house. This is a somewhat humbler house, but it reminds us that history and historic preservation isn't just for the mansions, but it's for all sorts of houses. This lovely little house was built around 1905 for Joseph and Sally Kaysen. They came to Waco from Meridian up in Bosque County, and Joseph Kaysen was a carpenter and contractor. So he built this for himself and for his family in 1905. One of his sons, Herman Kaysen, went on to become a prominent Waco architect in his own right. This is a photo that I took around 2002, and I'm glad that I did, because just a few years after this, a new owner picked up the house and moved it out of town. I have no idea where it is. If you find this house somewhere in the future, do let me know, because I think Waco needs it back. We need more houses from this 1905 time period. Not too far away from that house was this one, the Watson House, which was on Bosque Boulevard around 18th Street. And it was built for Charles and Mabel Wilson around 1923. The architect was Birch D. Easterwood, who has become very well known as the architect of many of the Baylor University buildings, including Patton F. Hall and Memorial Women's Dorm. He was a relatively young man when he designed this, and after he had been in business for 8 years in Waco from 1916 to 1924, he put out an ad in the local newspaper and listed the Easterwood landmarks that were in Waco, and this house was included. Unfortunately, there were some people who felt like there needed to be a parking lot where this house was standing, and so the house was torn down, and its site is still a parking lot today. Here is another wonderful Waco house, very impressive, and which is no longer with us. It's the Shear Kalyn house, which was on Columbus Avenue, built in 1910. Mr. Shear was the owner of a wholesale grocery company, a competitor of the Cooper family and Cooper Wholesale Grocery. He hired Milton W. Scott and T. Brooks Pearson to design this house for him. It was a very impressive house, excellent example of the Georgian style, the later style of colonial America. You can see that it's wider than most houses in that it has 7 bays across the front, 2 on each side, 3 in the middle. And the reason for that is that there's a very grand stair hall with what was known as an imperial staircase, which rose up in the center of the room and then branched off both to the left and right. So it was pretty flashy. A very well appointed and elegant colonial revival house. Unfortunately, it was purchased, dismantled, parts were sold to the highest bidder, and what was not sold was just torn down and taken away. It is now the site of what was supposed to be a garden. What there is, as far as I know, is a brick fence and a grassy plot behind it. So a very unfortunate loss for those who admire Waco's historic buildings. And a final house that was included in my book on historic homes of Waco, Texas, the Kenneth and Maud Ainsworth house. Kenneth Ainsworth was a doctor. He was also a collector of Texas history, artifacts, documents, and the like, and was the original donor to the Texas collection at Baylor. So a pretty important Wacoan. This house was built just on the edge of Cameron Park in 1925. The architect was Milton W. Scott, once again, one of the best known of Waco architects. And it's an interesting design with its red tile roof and the white plaster. You can see that it's very much inspired by some variant of the Spanish colonial revival. The focal point of the design is the little arcade supported by columns marking the entryway to the house, and there are balconies in front of several of the windows on the upper floor. It was a very interesting and handsome house. Unfortunately, in August of 2017, arson struck again, and the house burned. You can see through one of the windows up there blue sky where the roof had completely fallen in. The roof was not completely done away with, but ultimately the ruin of the house was just cleared away in 2018. So another sad loss. This one was in preparation in the book, so you can hear more about this house in my book on historic homes of Waco, Texas. So for more information about Waco houses in general, and the ones in particular that do survive and that you can drive by and admire, see my book, Historic Homes of Waco, Texas, published in 2019 by Texas A&M University Press. You can find it at the Mayborn Museum store and at fine bookstores everywhere. Many of these homes are also showcased in an exhibit at the Mayborn Museum complex called At Home in Waco. Opened in 2019 and is open in the first half or so of 2020. And it was made possible by a generous grant from the Summerlee Foundation of Dallas. So hope this has encouraged you to learn more about Waco's historic houses and historic buildings. Hope to talk to you again sometime soon.